So let's talk about the fun stuff, and that would be mining in the United States. And there needs to be a political will. But I would assume that there also has to be environmental impact studies that need to be handled. And that's got to take some time as well. Do they have the testosterone across both sides of the aisle politically here in the United States to actually start doing this here in the US? What's your take on that?
No, I don't believe it's going to really be feasible for either side, to really get behind this, because ultimately neither of their bases are pro-mining. Mines had their day, and they're now seen as a very 19th century kind of throwback to history. There is no appetite to now push domestic mining. Yes, there's regulations. Yes, this is normal in every democracy, but they don't want it in their backyard. I read this thing the other day about wind farms off Cape Cod, that you have an enclave of people who are very environmentally active, and yet they don't want to look at the wind farms.
Yeah.
So it's because apparently, according to the Kennedys who were there, it's difficult to land your plane with a wind farm, apparently upsets them. Which, I suppose is one rationale. But ultimately, I think that really sums it up. There are some communities still in the Appalachians and some communities that are pro-mining, but it's not on a national level. And I think that what we're looking at, there's a bill going through now called the REE Shore Act, where it classifies, say, tungsten as a rare earth. And they're basically saying that if you're in the defense contractor business in the US, you can't use Chinese sourced rare earths. And that includes manganese, lithium, tungsten, and then all the rare earths, the 17 of them that I can't even pronounce, the yttrium and the niobium and so on. But it also talks about stockpiling commodities, strategic minerals, and government offtakes. And I think that's the direction they're going to go. They're going to basically say, look, you got to build it where we can see transparency, but we're not going to say you should build it here. We're just going to say, here is a government contract. If you meet these conditions of ESG, we'll buy from you. And I think that's probably the most creative approach they can take.
Yeah.
So Lewis, a little bit lighter of a question. How much earth do you have to move to get enough tungsten to make, let's just say, one semiconductor? And I know you've already mentioned they're very, very small.
Well, I mean, to be honest, not a huge amount, because we use, the tungsten that's used in a semiconductor is crushed down to a nano size fraction, which is then injected into a gas, because you can't smelt a tungsten. And then the gas is pumped into each semiconductor that coats on a microscopic level a coating of tungsten, because one, it's very conductive, and secondly, it dissipates heat. So you don't have to worry about, cobalt in anodes, they combust, a battery can go up and it burns, 48 hours. You put tungsten on that same anode, it'll get as hot as the sun and it won't smelt. Well, the temperature of the sun, it will smelt tungsten, but it's non-combustible. So
but very hot.
It can take the heat. So you don't need a huge, the entire planet, we only produce about 90,000 tons a year of tungsten. That's it. So it's very dense, same density as gold, but we don't we don't move a lot of earth.
I got you.
Comparative. So
when a mine is kind of fished out, so to speak, is there a reclamation process that you guys do around the globe? I know you have mines elsewhere. I would assume that process would be different in the United States due to our regulation. Can you elaborate on that?
You're working in a democracy. That's all pretty much the same.
Oh, is it?
Thing. Yeah. It's you have certain, different, like in Canada, for instance, now you have First Nations as well that have to be consulted. In Australia, you have the Indigenous Aboriginal people. So you have these additional layers, but ultimately in terms of reclamation, environmental compliance, the international standards are just that now. They're pretty much across the board. I think the main difference in the US is that even if you comply to all of the regulations and all the law that exists, you can still run into trouble if the political will is against you. So there's the legal framework in the United States. There's also the emotional framework, and that can also impact you. So that's something to also consider in the US.
Yeah. So which has more impact on the land? Is it oil drilling, strip mining? What has more impact on the land? What type of
strip mining?
Strip mining.
Strip mining. I mean, drilling for oil is you're drilling. It's a hole, and they cap the hole after you finished, and that's the end of it. When you strip mine, I mean, we hard rock mine and we strip mine. The strip mine, you have to, when you finish, you have to fill in the hole. It's a big hole, but in that time where the hole exists, it's very visible. The mine in South Korea is underground, and we've developed systems where we put all of our waste and all of our tailings back underground, so that there'll be no evidence that we're there, and that's the future. But strip mining it has a lot more of an impact environmentally, well, optically, environmentally.
Yeah, so that's a big nay. So I for one am in full favor of the bill. I'd like to see it actually increased. The amount of money that we put towards some of the most absurd things just defies logic. Our dependence on China is ridiculous. It's costing jobs. It's blowing up prices left and right. And if we have the ability to eat more of the semiconductor pie, we may as well open our mouths. That's the way I look at it, though. So,
well, the United States is the big consumer of semiconductors. I mean, it's a classic example of how globalization has put everyone sort of, in a precarious position. The US consumes more semiconductors than anybody else, and yet you really don't produce any semiconductors. That doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, but then you can say that about many, many industries. I mean, the car sector in the Europe right now, they have problems with the wiring looms. They have companies that make the wiring looms and then ship them to the car plants to be installed. They have problems because over the years they've been pushing subcontracting that out further and further east because they've been following the cheap labor. And they're now done by Ukraine. Of course, now Ukraine is rather busy to be making looms for Volkswagens. Yeah. So, you have, car plants that are sitting idle because they don't have anyone else right away that can now replicate that job. So I think this is probably a good wake-up call to say, you know what, globalization is a wonderful idea, but you've got to remember sometimes chasing, the cheap route can cost you a lot more in the long run.